Welcome to Israel Unpacked, the JNF USA webinar series featuring the Jerusalem Post. This is episode 1, Military Myths, in which we're going to talk with Colonel Richard Kemp. Colonel Kemp served in the British Army as an officer for almost 30 years, seeing operation in war zones such as Afghanistan. I'd like to start off with one of the greatest myths surrounding this conflict, and that's the accusation of genocide, that the Israeli military is conducting a genocide against the Gazan population. In your opinion, what should students know about the conduct of the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza, and what would you look for in a force to determine if it was actually committing a genocide?
Well, thank you for that. It's a pleasure to be with you. The accusation of genocide against Israel is nothing short of an obscenity. It's the furthest thing from the truth. And the reality is that Israel is taking every conceivable measure it can, and more than most countries have ever done in history, probably more than any country in history, to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians while trying to destroy a terrorist organization that has repeatedly attacked Israel over many years, and of course, most infamously in October last year. An army that was trying to carry out genocide, or a country that was trying to carry out a genocide, would not care. In fact, it would want to maximize the total number of people it killed, whether they were terrorists or civilians, whether it was by attacking or by starving them or depriving them of water or whatever. They would want to kill as many of the people as possible. And that is the exact opposite of what the IDF is doing. The IDF is taking immense care to minimize civilian casualties. It's doing everything it can to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. Of course, that's not a perfect supply of aid, because it's Hamas that then seize the aid, use it for their own purposes to strengthen their military organization. But Israel's intention here is very clear: to destroy Hamas while minimizing civilian deaths, the opposite of genocide. If you want to see a real genocide, real genocidal intent today, you just have to look at Hamas. In Hamas's charter is the intention to commit genocide. They want to destroy the Jewish state. They want to kill Jews in Israel and everywhere around the world, laid down in their own charter. Their actions on the 7th of October confirmed it: indiscriminate mass butchery, killing of civilians as well as military, without any discrimination whatsoever. And their leaders have repeated that they will do it again and again and again until Israel is destroyed. And their actions every day, they carry out rocket attacks. They carry out rocket attacks daily towards the Israeli civilian population, or at least they did do it daily until they were stopped by the IDF. So we're seeing deliberate, intentional genocide from Hamas, which won't succeed because they don't have the capability, but they certainly have the intent, and the opposite from Israel.
So a lot of the allegations about genocide against the Israeli military are based off of just pure numerical weight that is expressed in figures that come out of the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza. Do you think that we can take these figures at face value, and why do you think many members of the media do?
Well, certainly you can't take anything that any terrorist organization, including Hamas, says at face value. That includes the death statistics in Gaza. They have traditionally and historically exaggerated these death figures and in previous conflicts. And the reason for it is very clear: because they want Israel to be vilified, isolated, condemned by the world community, and they want Israel to be forced to stop attacking Hamas by international pressure. And we've seen the effect that has. And the best possible weapon, apart from false accusations, I should say, of starvation in Gaza, the best possible weapon is to accuse Israel of mass murder of innocent civilians. So no, we shouldn't take their figures at face value. But just for a moment, let's assume that they're roughly broadly accurate. I'm not saying they are, but we don't have anything else to go on. And their figures at present, I think, it varies a lot. They do revise them. They sometimes get embarrassed by being exposed for telling lies, and therefore they change their figures. But let's say roughly today, the claim by Hamas is about 30,000 civilians killed inside Gaza. And what they're saying really is that the only people that are getting killed inside Gaza are civilians, which of course is a absolute lie. The reality, and let's, as I say, we just take out, in theory, these 30,000. I'm not saying that it's accurate, but what we do have from the IDF is an estimate of about 16,000 terrorists killed since the campaign began. That, again, is not 100% accurate because it can't be given the circumstance of war zone, but it's going to be pretty close to it. Otherwise, the IDF would not give those figures. The IDF, unlike Hamas, are not prone to lie about statistics and their efforts. So let's say 16,000. That means that the ratio of civilian to military deaths in Gaza is less than 1-to-1. The ratio of civilians to combatants less than 1-to-1. I estimate it's probably closer to around 0.8-to-1 or even better than that. Now that sounds terrible. It really does sound terrible. You know, Israel's trying to kill military, trying to kill terrorists, and it ends up killing almost as many civilians. But if you compare it to other wartime statistics from other conflicts, comparable conflicts, in Iraq, the United States forces and their allies killed something like 3 civilians to every combatant that died. In Afghanistan, the estimate was approximately 5 civilians to every combatant that died. That's a very big difference, a very big difference. The United Nations issued a document a few years back estimating that in urban conflict around the world since the Second World War, around 9 civilians died for every combatant killed. That includes all different types of conflict. So it's not particularly relevant here, but Afghanistan and Iraq certainly are, because the US forces and their allies use similar methods to the methods used by the Israelis, both to attack the enemy and also to try and minimize civilian deaths. But even that 0.8-to-1 or 1-to-1, if you want to be more broad about it, even that is not an accurate figure in any way, because from the total number of deaths that Hamas claim, you then have to deduct deaths by natural causes. In a population of 2 million, there's going to be a large number of people who die from a heart attack or from cancer or from old age or whatever it might be. And on top of that, you then have to take away the large number of people that Hamas have deliberately killed themselves inside Gaza. That's a significant figure, whether it's by rockets dropping short on that were aimed at Israel that land inside Gaza, or people they've simply executed. So the 0.8-to-1 statistic that I've given you is the worst case, I would say, the worst possible case. We don't know these other figures. We don't have a clue what they are, but they're going to make a significant difference to the overall total. And the other thing that people watching this should remember is that whereas in Afghanistan and Iraq and other comparable theaters of operations, while the enemy, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Islamic State, they didn't really care about their own civilian casualties. But what they did not do is what Hamas does. Hamas deliberately tries to lure the IDF to kill as many civilians as possible, as many of their own civilians as possible. And I said just now what the purpose of that is. The purpose is to bring vilification onto Israel. And when Israel warns civilians that they're about to attack a target, so they should leave that area, which they do, using millions of leaflets dropped, millions of phone calls, voice messages, text messages sent to individual civilians in Gaza. Very often, Hamas will force them to stay when they're advised by the IDF to leave. They will force them to stay so that they do get killed. So this is the reality of the situation. And what we're talking about, let's not forget, since the war began, Hamas fired more than 10,000 missiles from Gaza into Israel. These were not precisely aimed missiles. These were missiles aimed at the civilian population in Israel. So what Israel is being accused of, both in terms of genocide, indiscriminate killing, etc., they're all lies. The reality is that's exactly what Hamas is doing.
So we've discussed some of the, I guess, more strategic myths And I like to look at some more tactical ones that get bandied about. And one of those that has become a medic is that the IDF has dropped more bombs than some World War II bombing campaigns, or has dropped explosives with more force than that of the nuclear bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima. And this sounds very dramatic for a great many people who are uninitiated in military affairs. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, these comparisons, I've heard a lot about them. And these comparisons are deliberately intended to paint Israel in a bad light, to kind of provide some kind of proof of genocidal intent or indiscriminate killing. There is no comparison between the Second World War and what's going on in Gaza. And there's really no real comparison between what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and what's going on in Gaza. This is a unique conflict. Let's not forget, we've got a very, very densely packed population in Gaza. There's something like 20 different cities inside Gaza, all of which contain large numbers of terrorists inside the civilian population. And of course, then there's over 400 miles of tunnels underneath Gaza, all heavily fortified. So this is almost a unique situation. And I think making any comparison between explosive used in other conflicts, particularly the Second World War, and Gaza is entirely spurious. In the Second World War, one point to be aware of in the Second World War is that the munitions used were, generally speaking, were dumb bombs, which were just dropped on large areas, sometimes large urban areas, to get at military targets there, and did kill a large number of civilians. The IDF use almost not exclusively, because there is not an unlimited supply, but they use almost exclusively guided weapons, which are deliberately aimed at pinpointing and hitting a specific terrorist target. And sometimes they do have to use unguided bombs, but they have techniques that they use to maximize the accuracy of those bombs, to minimize civilian casualties. And they tailor their munitions. They use the right size of munition to destroy the target while minimizing civilian deaths. And when we talk about things like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, again, the comparison is totally spurious. We've already discussed the possibility that up to 30,000 civilians may have been, or 30,000 people may have been killed inside Gaza. In Hiroshima, the number that were killed in just one day was between 90,000 and 140,000 people killed in just one day by that one nuclear bomb. And in Nagasaki, it was up to 80,000 killed. So we can't draw any conclusion. All we can bear in mind is that those people that use these comparisons and these statistics are deliberately intending to paint Israel into the worst possible light.
Another element that's brought up often, an alternative course of action that Israel should have taken at the beginning of the war is the idea that the military should have used exclusively special forces to go in to do pinpoint raids, to free the hostages, go into the tunnels somehow, and this would have been a superior alternative than a full-on ground invasion. And multiple people have made this claim, often people without military experience, but how would you respond to such a proposal?
I've heard many people telling me that the IDF is, including military experts and former military commanders, etc., telling me that the IDF is fighting this campaign all wrong. But when you ask them, and I've done it many times, when you ask them how should the IDF do it then, there's very rarely any answer. They don't know. They just know Israel's wrong, mainly because of the distortions and the lies that they see in the media, which don't in any way give the full picture and almost always give an incorrect picture. But one of the suggestions that people do sometimes make, as you say, is that they should have restricted their operations to raids, special forces operations, etc. That, of course, is totally unrealistic. You're looking at a military force. These are not kind of like a sort of terrorist insurgency like you saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a full-fledged military force, at least 30,000 strong, which cannot be dealt with, particularly given the amount of time they've had to prepare the ground they're fighting on, the ambush positions, the the tunnels themselves, the escape routes, the booby traps, the camera systems they've got all around Israel, all around Gaza, monitoring what the Israelis are doing. All of these things mean that the only way that you can deal with a force of that strength is by significant, high intensity military operations of the sort we've seen so far. Now, among those operations, we have seen special forces raids, we've seen more pinpoint strikes against specific terrorist targets and to rescue hostages as well. So it forms part of the overall equation, but these could not have been used alone. They would have had that sort of tactics been used on their own. They certainly would not have achieved the kind of success that the IDF has achieved. As I said before, killing more than half of the Hamas terrorists. And many of the ones who were not killed have escaped. They've run away. They've become civilians again, at least for the time being. That could not have been achieved by special forces operations. All that would have been achieved by that is relatively limited damage and probably a lot more Israeli military deaths than we've seen already.
For our last question, I'd like to touch on the potential endgames. One of the claims made by critics of Israel is that a military force can only take you so far, that it isn't possible to eliminate Hamas and other terrorist organizations through the use of military force. What are your thoughts on this? Is it possible to eliminate Hamas, as some politicians propose to do?
Yeah, you always hear the same thing if you hear the same people talking as I do, and the catchphrase is Hamas is an ideology, and you can't destroy an ideology. And I think that's a reasonable thing to say. You can't destroy an ideology. You can't destroy it totally. For example, if you take the Nazis in the Second World War, their ideology wasn't destroyed. It still exists in a pretty limited form, but it still exists. And the same with the Japanese. But their forces were both totally, not annihilated, but they were totally neutralized. And the same can happen to Hamas. The IDF, as I said, has already killed a very large number of Hamas fighters. There are still some left. Some will survive this. The IDF will not be able to destroy every single Hamas fighter. It wouldn't be possible. And it's not necessary either. Because if you have an ideology that threatens you, as Hamas's ideology threatens Israel, then that ideology is not a great danger to you unless it's backed up by viable military force that can attack you. And yes, the IDF can, and I believe will, destroy Hamas's capability to represent a serious continuing threat to Israel. That's not going to be done by the conclusion of intensive combat operations inside Gaza, which may occur within the next couple of weeks. It may be that we hear from the IDF that they have completed the destruction of the main Hamas formed military units. But that's not the end of it, because they will attempt to rise up again. They will attempt to reform. And other terrorist organizations, also sponsored by Iran, will attempt to do the same thing. And so the IDF will have a long-term ongoing mission in Gaza. However that's conducted depends on the orders of the IDF commanders. But it will be an ongoing mission to prevent Hamas from rising again and representing another significant threat, so that it can carry out rocket attacks into Israel, and it can carry out attacks like October the 7th. I believe that those will be, assuming that the IDF pursues this campaign to its conclusion, those will be eliminated. The biggest aspect that is preventing the IDF from doing this more quickly is international pressure. And that international pressure comes from the kind of lies that we hear about the way that Israel's conducting its operations. It emanates to a large extent from people trying to stop Israel from carrying out its operations because of civilian deaths and because of alleged starvation inside Gaza, which is simply not happening. So assuming that Israel is able to overcome that international pressure, then I believe that Hamas, as a significant threat to Israel, can be destroyed. I've been into Gaza myself on a number of occasions. I've seen the way that the IDF fight. I've seen that the way Hamas fight. The two things are incomparable. The IDF is fighting very, very powerfully and very effectively. And the only hope that Hamas have of survival in any form really is if Israel is prevented from completing this operation. Despite all of the lies and the distortions that we're seeing around the world, the IDF is, as I've explained, is fighting according to the laws of war and according to the morality of the state of Israel, which is second to none. But despite all that, despite what I say and despite what other people say who agree with me, there is a wall of anti-Israel propaganda, which is extremely hard to overcome. It's the dominant narrative in this conflict. But I think every single person who's watching this, or those who aren't watching this, has a duty, in a way, to do what small amount you can to get the truth out there, to stick up for Israel. Okay, we can't all do a hell of a lot, but some of us can do a certain amount. And I think we have a duty to do that, even when it seems that our voices aren't being heard, because collectively our voices do definitely make a difference. Israel's going to emerge from this stronger than it went into it. And those of us who are able to contribute to Israel's success here will be able to take at least some credit for preventing this attempt to annihilate the state of Israel.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, Colonel Kemp. With this episode of JNF USA, I'm Michael Starr, Diaspora Affairs Correspondent with the Jerusalem Post, and I hope you'll join us for future episodes in this series that explore myths such as the ones exposed by Colonel Kemp. Thank you.